several weeks ago, a United States federal court judge really threw Georgia's political landscape into chaos when he ruled that the state's voting maps that lawmakers adopted in late 2021 violates portions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, meaning that the Georgians will soon possibly live in brand new congressional, state house, and state Senate legislative districts. And we are so happy, as always, to be joined by one of the foremost experts on political developments in Georgia, Dr. Benjamin Taylor of Kennesaw State University. And really, Doctor, tell us what was behind the court's ruling. I actually covered the last redistricting process at the state capitol in November of 2021. I remember a lot of the chaos and the confusion and some pretty heated rhetoric. These maps took effect and have been in effect, really since the latter part of 2021 and early 2022. Now all of a sudden they're unconstitutional. Why?
Well, according to the ruling that has just come down from the federal courts, it comes down to whether or not the legislature used race or partisanship to construct the districts. So the judge in the case was persuaded by the arguments by the plaintiffs that, in fact, race was the deciding motivator in the districts, and racial gerrymanders are and have been for decades declared by federal and state courts alike unconstitutional. What is not unconstitutional, and what the legislative attorneys representing the state and the legislature and have tried to make the case to say, is that no, these are in fact political or partisan gerrymanders, which are perfectly constitutional and in fact are as old as the Republic. The name gerrymander comes from the early 1800s, where an anti-federalist, Elbridge Gerry, it was Gary, not Jerry, but Gary, drew districts in Massachusetts to privilege his anti-federalist friends. And that was all the rage in the early 1800s. People were shocked by it. And since that time, courts and politicians throughout the United States have been using politics to draw district lines to privilege parties. The problem is, particularly in the post-Voting Rights Act era, if you use race to make those decisions, you get in trouble. That's not constitutionally allowable. It violates equal protection. But partisan politics, perfectly allowable. So the task then for the legislature is to draw districts where they can successfully say in court that these are partisan gerrymanders, not racial gerrymanders. But in states like Georgia, that's difficult because we have fairly racialized politics along partisan lines. That is to say that you have precious few African-American Republicans. And so anytime you are drawing districts that are partisan, they also look racial, whether or not that is your intent. And so the task for legislatures for decades in Georgia, regardless of whether it's Democratic legislators or Republican legislators, has been to draw district lines that do not crack. This is the big problem for federal courts, is cracking minority populations so that they are their voting power is diluted. That's the big issue.
Is it even possible in this day and age to draw partisan lines, partisan districts, without a racial motivation behind it?
That's a great question. It's an empirical question. I don't know the answer. I think some states have been successful. North Carolina, for instance, has just they currently have, there are 14 members of the congressional delegation in North Carolina, just like Georgia, and they currently have a 7-7 Democratic Republican breakdown. But the legislature and the politics of North Carolina are very complex. But the bottom line is the legislature there, with the help of their state Supreme Court, which is a partisan court, by the way, unlike Georgia's courts, which are nonpartisan ostensibly, the partisan court in North Carolina, along with the Republican legislature, have now drawn districts that are 10-4 Republican Democratic. using partisanship specifically. And so we'll see if they stand up to federal court muster, but they say they've done it. So maybe it's possible. The big issue though is that the federal the opinion of the court requires that the legislature draw a new majority minority district for the congressional level in West Atlanta, right? So which is going to affect Drew Ferguson, potentially Marjorie Taylor Greene, certainly will affect David Scott because he currently holds that what was at one time the sort of West Atlanta majority minority district. He still has that district, but now it's either the lines are going to change. It's very much up in the air. And so this is sort of getting Georgia back to the pre-2020 maps, if you will, of where you had the 7th and 6th congressional districts were very competitive, slightly Democratic. Now the Georgia 6th district or a 7th district, I forget exactly which, but one is very Democratic and one is very Republican. So odds are good that those lines are going to change and make some of those are going to become more competitive. So that's the issue for the Georgia legislature, is that the gerrymander that resulted after the 2020 census resulted in a bunch of safe seats for Democrats and Republicans. It just so happens that Republicans also gained an advantage in one of those seats. That is to say, the Rich McCormick's district, right? So that district became very Republican. Whereas in the future, it could be more competitive, or there's going to be more competitiveness on the west side of Atlanta with a majority minority district. So that's the trick for the legislature to draw those seats. But I think the more interesting component of this is the state legislative districts themselves, not just Congress, but they get to draw their own districts, of course, the legislature. And the courts require that they have different districts for those seats as well. And so what those look like is going to be really interesting. And I think that is going to be the place where, because the legislature is fairly solidly Republican, it's this, 32 to 23 Republican majority in the Senate, 98 to 79 Republican majority in the House. But those majorities have been reduced over the last few election cycles. And so I can imagine that any reshuffling of districts at this point could introduce more competitiveness and shrink those majorities even more, which Republicans in the legislature would, if at all possible, not want to do.
It used to be that we had new voting maps that were issued every 10 years as required by the results of the every new decade census. Now, we've had a couple of different maps. We're having to go back, we're redrawing them. I mean, what are the chances that I can't see it happening in 2024, but what would happen? Is it possible for us to see a Democratic majority in the state house or the state Senate between now and 2030, when the next census is due?
Well, that is a great question. I would say that a lot of it depends on what these new maps look like. And a lot of it depends on the demographic changes in Georgia as we move forward towards 2030. Namely, Georgia is growing. The economy is robust. It's attracting people. The film industry and other industries in Georgia are growing at clips that are bringing in voting age populations. Right. This is not just this isn't just sort of general population growth. This is very economically motivated population growth in Georgia that is bringing in voting age populations and also demographics of people who are likely to be engaged in the voting process. And so the way that changes Georgia politically is an empirical question and one that we'll have to just sort of wait and see how it goes. But I would not be surprised if, I don't know what the odds are particularly on the legislature being at least one chamber Democratic by 2030, but the competitiveness of Georgia's legislature is not going away. That's for sure. And it's much more competitive now than it was 10 years ago, and certainly 10 years before that. And so I think that all of that plays into sort of the anxieties of both the Republican and Democratic operatives and leaders who are trying to engage on this issue in terms of getting districts redrawn. And you bring up a really interesting point, which is that, once upon a time, when America was great, you might say, that you only drew district lines once every 10 years. But really, that began to change about the turn of the century, right? So Georgia was on the forefront of this, right? We had a Democratic legislature, had a Democratic legislature for 150 years. They saw the writing on the wall with the voting trend changes, partisan realignment over the solid South, moving to the Republican Party from the presidential level with Reagan and trickling down finally to the state legislative level by about 2000. And you saw in the 2002 election, you saw that even though Democrats won on election night, their majorities remained in the House and Senate. Incoming Governor Sonny Perdue was able to convince enough state senators to switch over to the Republican Party to give the Republicans a majority in the state Senate in 2000, beginning in the legislative session 2003. And so that was the sort of the move that moved away. And the Democrats had drawn districts after the previous legislative session that were extremely weird looking and just sort of like baffled anyone who had any ideas about what they thought legislative and congressional districts should look like, because they were trying to maintain their power. And that was really the last gasp of the Democratic Party in Georgia for a while. But now they've become more competitive. And so I don't doubt that Republicans may have every incentive to do similar things with the maps, right? Because have some funky looking maps. But I still think that unlike the Democratic Party's issues in 2000, 2002, 2004, the Republican Party is not finding itself in Georgia geographically constrained the way the Democratic Party had become. And so I think that as a result, their maps don't have to look as weird. And so they will not have as much trouble with courts in terms of drawing the maps to look strange and like grabbing certain neighborhoods and things like this to keep maps sort of partisan leaning towards Republicans. So that will make their job a bit easier, but I still think the competitiveness is going to be on the rise. And if by chance there was a Democratic majority in the House or Senate by 2030, that changes everything for the next official cycle of redistricting. But again, as you pointed out, and the point I was trying to make a moment ago was that the cycle of redrawing lines, when Republicans finally took the legislature in total in 2005, after the 2004 elections and got the House majority, they redrew the lines. In the middle of the decade, they just took it upon themselves. They said, this is a terrible gerrymander the Democrats did 4 years ago. We're going to redo it. And they did. And the same thing happened in Texas when they had a similar demographic and political shift about the same time. And so we have seen that if you can get power, even in the middle of the decade, a power shift from one party to the other, they'll redraw the lines to suit them, to suit themselves and to suit their party if they want.
And in terms of competitiveness, moving on to a national standpoint, Georgia currently has 9 Republicans, 5 Democrats in its 14 congressional districts on Capitol Hill. Before this last redrawing, I believe it was 8 and 6. Yeah. So, I'm assuming we're going to kind of see maybe a return to the 8 and 6 breakdown after these new maps are drawn. How does that impact the balance of power in Congress when you have a Republican Party that's holding on by a razor-thin majority, has very poor discipline even within its own ranks, from what we've seen through the process of selecting a new speaker in a political environment where one seat can make all the difference? How does Georgia play into that scenario moving forward?
Well, that's a great question. And Georgia will be very important. As you point out, a single seat can make all the difference in the world, particularly in these narrow majorities that even the Democratic majority in the 117th Congress was quite narrow, right? I mean, they had just a 5 to 6 seat majority. The Republicans have a similarly small 10-ish, 11-ish seat majority. And so I think the days of having 40, 50 seat majorities, we might not see those for some time. They could come back, but in the current political environment, it's hard to see massive majorities like that in the House in the foreseeable future. But But remember, Georgia, we may shift our seats one of that, but remember, North Carolina is 7-7 right now. They're going to a 10-4 map. New York, based on their own state laws, had created some anti-gerrymandering processes and to try to create more competitive districts. But their political power players understand the lay of the land, and so they're going to revisit their maps to try to create more democratic seats, right? And so a lot of these states that had put in place anti-gerrymandering laws, state laws, to try to make their seats more competitive and generate more parity between the parties, more equality, sort of try to even out seats. They have realized that their states like Georgia and North Carolina are not doing that, right, unless they're forced to do it by the courts. And so some of those states are revisiting their own laws. And so I think it's hard to say exactly, except for the fact that it's all playing into the general environment where state level political leaders understand the downstream effects of these decisions and want to make sure that they are helping out their party as much as they can. You can't predict everything, right? Sean Mahoney or Maloney, shoot, I forget his last name, but he was the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee chair from New York in 2022. He which you don't get that job unless you have a pretty safe seat. He lost because of the way the New York legislature redrew his district. And so, sometimes you can redraw lines with the best of intentions and they don't work out the way you wanted. So, and there are shifts, right? I mean, Georgia's previous map, the Lucy McBath and now the Richmond McCormick district, Carolyn Bordeaux's district, former district, those were drawn to be very strong Republican districts. Tom Price could have been elected to Congress until the day he died had he not gone to the Trump administration, most likely. It would have been very difficult to imagine anybody defeating Tom Price in that district. And yet, it was trending Democratic, and Lucy McBath turned the corner. John Ossoff in the special election helped move it along, but that became a Democratic district despite being gerrymandered as a strong Republican district. So things can change on the ground that legislators can't necessarily foresee in the future. So a lot of variables here, but in the end, I think that what we're looking at for the near term is just an extremely competitive environment for Congress, the House particularly, for the next while, and the evolutions of gerrymandering. And plus, gerrymandering is so precise now, right? I mean, a lot of people are thinking that the districts may change, but I don't know. I would put my guess to be that whatever maps come out of the legislature, the special session called by Governor Kemp, probably going to be more status quo than anything else, because the technology, the mapping, GIS software is so sophisticated now that you can draw, congressional and state legislative district lines down to the address in ways that you just couldn't decades before, right? When gerrymandering was much more blunt. And so now it's much more precise. And I think that odds are good that will basically result in maps that don't change much, if anything.
As we wrap up this edition of Political Update with Dr. Ben Taylor, outstanding expert and professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, your last point, gerrymandering is so precise, right down to the very address. In my district, I live in the 6th, and yet that is a district that has been heavily drawn to remain Republican. Historically, it has, with people like Newt Gingrich and Johnny Isakson, Tom Price holding it. But I've never had, in my little area of the 6th, is heavily Democratic. I've never had a Republican candidate come knock on my door and ask for a vote. What message does that send to voters as far as whether or not they should even participate in the American electoral process?
Well, that's a really good question. And what this really comes down to is what is the goal of any political process, and what are the incentives for the people who are decision makers in that process to achieve the goal? So if you're a citizen, then your goal in an election process, theoretically, would be to have 2 or however many parties can qualify. But in our system, as single member districts, the first past the post election. So we're going to have a 2-party system, more or less. So if you have 2 parties, you've got a Republican, you've got a Democrat, or change their names if you want, but it's going to be 2 parties. You have 2 parties. If as a citizen, your goal is probably something like, I want to have a legitimate choice. I want to have actual competition, and I want the candidates to have to compete for my vote, right? That's sort of the goal that a citizen might have. That is not the goal that a legislator has when drawing congressional or legislative districts. Their goal is to win. Their goal is for their party to win. So the goals of citizens having legitimate choices and competition for their vote is not the goal that a legislator has when they're drawing congressional districts. So that is the first sort of a crux that we have to deal with. And the second is, when decision makers are faced with this, what choices do they have? If your goal is to win, then you don't have any incentive, right, to draw a competitive district. You want to draw the least competitive district you can. You want to draw a district that's going to be very safe, because you want to be able, for your opponent, right? Imagine you're a Democratic majority drawing districts for the Democratic and Republican parties. You want to be able to say to your Republican opponents who are complaining about the gerrymandering, well, hey, you've got safe districts. We've got 10 seats and 3 of them are safely Democratic. You've got yours. We've got ours. So you can be quiet now, right? So you've accomplished your goal, which is maintain your political power, but you haven't thought about what the goals of the citizens are, which is potentially competition and what have you. So that's sort of the conundrum that any policymakers find themselves in any political decision generally, but particularly when it comes to redrawing districts. Citizens then, therefore, become disenchanted. They become disengaged. They don't feel very efficacious about the chances that they can have an effect. And, from a normative point of view, that can be troublesome for the long-term health of a democratic society. But again, none of that is particularly new. Gerrymandering is as old as the Republic in a lot of ways, but the scientific precision with which we can gerrymander districts could not have possibly been imagined, by Elbridge Gerry or anyone who had sort of the first movers in this process. So that is different, and that's something that you got to deal with, I think, as a political society moving forward. When you can draw district lines so precisely that you can slice neighborhoods and counties and cities and all kinds of stuff, then that's different than just saying, oh, we're trying to help the Democratic Party of the Republic. You're being very, very, very surgical in how you do that, and that creates perverse outcomes.
And that's the role of technology that is playing in our American political process. Dr. Ben Taylor, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for your time. We're going to continue to cover the issue of redistricting extensively here at Atlanta News First and atlantanewsfirst.com. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First.